Hey everybody, welcome back to Prototype. We're on to the second episode. This time around I'm going to talk about a couple of things that are a little bit more specific to an RTS game design background instead of just sort of jumping all over the place, because the first episode, I think you guys could tell, I was eager to get it out. I was eager to just blab my way through a whole bunch of different things, but this time I think we're going to be doing things a little bit differently. I didn't really talk about the format of like how I choose the title for the episode. The first episode was just like an excerpt from something that I said in the episode. I don't know if all of them will be like that, but I guess you'll find out if you click this video and you find the exact bit according to the title. That might actually happen, right? You never know. So anyway, I'm recording this on the evening, Wednesday, the 22nd of February, 2023. It is 11:38, so it is almost the end of the day. And as we get on, and I'm assuming based on how long the first episode was, this will probably take me into the next day. Let's talk about mirror matchups in an RTS. So mirror matchups are a little bit fucked up. In every RTS that I have ever seen, the mirror matchups end up being very, very different fundamentally to the asymmetric matchups, I guess you could call them, the non-mirror matchups. And a lot of people, no matter what RTS it is, be it, the two big ones that I'm mostly familiar with in the competitive space would be StarCraft 1 and StarCraft 2, but especially in Brood War, you think about Zerg versus Zerg, it might be one of the most laughable matchups that in all of RTSs. I know that's like a very broad thing to say, so maybe it's just one of the goofiest ones in the StarCraft franchise, certainly the goofiest one in Brood War. But, there's that in, this sort of TVT aspect in StarCraft 2 where everybody kind of loathes it because it almost always turns into this really big slog back and forth and really hard to end games early, but also really hard to deviate from any specific meta that develops. And I think we're starting to see a little bit of that in Cosmonarchy Brood War, our big conversion for Brood War. But specifically, it also is very dependent on the maps, right? And some maps lend to more interesting gameplay than others for, despite whatever the matchup is, right? And that's sort of like hinting at maybe what we'll talk about a little bit later in this episode is I think you can do map-specific changes or just have a unique map pool for each particular matchup or something to that effect. And basically, you might have some maps that are deemed, fitting for many matchups, but like blacklisted for other specific ones because of whatever reason. And then, you might have some matchups that are more specialist and are only, good on a specific, some maps that are only good for specific matchups. That might be something that you think about as well. So when you're thinking about all of these things and you're sort of piecing them all together, one of the things that I always think about is I try to understand, like, if you're going to try to solve a problem, it's really important to understand that problem so you don't like end up having any unforeseen consequences. Usually there's going to be those anyway, no matter how good your understanding of the problem is. So I would break down the problem of mirror matchups as you tend to feel more acutely a sense that you cannot deviate from a specific agreed upon, style or something. And in Cosmonarchy Brood War, it seems like from what I've reported, to a lesser extent what I've seen myself, but just in general what I've reported, if you don't build the Quasrock pool first, which gives you a lot of mineral-only options and low gas options, then you kind of are throwing the game. Like it's really hard to hold on or something to that effect. I still feel like good players could do it, but as player skill gets better with things like Zethar cores and Vorvar cores and Quasilisks and even, to a lesser extent Aether cores and stuff, then maybe that would actually still be harder at a high level. And so maybe it would always end up being that you go Quasrock first. But, I still suspect that there's more, more things to play with there. And especially even if you grant the premise that you must go this structure first, because the obviously other common structure that you go first is the Hydrock Den. If you decide to go the Quasrock first, then, okay, well, you can kind of agree with that because you kind of go Quasrock first on a lot of other matchups or on a lot of other specific maps. And if you accept that premise, then you can say, okay, that's the premise that I'm working with him. But still, even after that, maybe there's like a lot of dynamic things you can do, right? Because you can choose to go like Zork with your Quasrock, or you can go Hydrock with your Quasrock, or I don't know, you can maybe stabilize such that you build a lot of Quasilisks and then you expand and then you're good for like versus a bunch of different options or whatever. But the thing about mirror matchups is that you guys have all of the same tools. And so if you make a decision that would put you at a disadvantage if the other person made a different decision, then you have to account for that, right, in some other way. And it's more acutely obvious to you when you're in a mirror matchup. So the example, if we go to Zerg again, if you spend some of your larva, and this is true of Brood War and of StarCraft 2, and not just Cosmonarchy Brood War, but if you spend some of your larva on units instead of workers, and your other guy spends the larva on workers instead of units, then he can have an economic advantage, but you can have a military advantage. And if you don't press the military advantage, then he gets ahead. Likewise, he will feel pressured against spending his larva on workers if you're constantly trying to goad him into spending it on combat units instead. And so that's like an obvious case where that's sort of the limited factor there. You can kind of see this in pretty much any matchup because you have the same tools, but it's just more pronounced, I think, in Zerg, in cases that involve Zerg, I guess, because the larva mechanic means that you unify your sources of workers and military units, whereas obviously that's not true for the other races. Now, that has an advantage for Zerg in that, like, when they have a decent amount of larva banked up in the mid to late game, then they can remax their worker count very quickly, or they can, like, quickly mass up enough workers to saturate a base or something way faster than any of the other races. But it takes time to scale up to that point, right? And so until you get to that point, you're kind of in a weird spot where you don't want to overbuild workers because then you won't have enough combat units to stave off your doom. And you don't want to overbuild combat units because then you won't have enough economy to scale into the mid game. So it's this tightrope that you're constantly walking. And you can walk that tightrope a lot easier when the guy on like the other side isn't also walking that tightrope in some weird version of this analogy where depending on what he does, you might fall from your tightrope. You know what I mean? So like, it's a lot easier in a Zerg versus Zerg matchup for you to make a decision that that your opponent, assuming they're aware of it, exposes, right? And exploits. And that is one of those things where I think it's just because of the fact that you guys are, using the same tool set and stuff. And maybe that's also because like Zerg are a very volatile race because of the fact that they have that larva mechanic. Now, I am open to both sides of the aisle on Zerg specifically. I don't want to make this about Zerg specifically, but if we take for a second that topic, it's like, should you have a situation where you get your workers from the same place that you get your military and have it be like a significant thing? Yeah, I mean, like, I really like the idea that everything comes from that. Like, you guys know my design sensibilities by now if you've been following the channel and the games and stuff. I just like when things cleanly fit and it's like, yeah, this comes from that. And so does everything else or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of neat. But also, I'm partial to the idea that maybe, just maybe, it actually doesn't matter. And it's just always going to be bad. And you're always going to have this volatility. I think maybe that the fact that we're seeing it play out across 3 different games that are all very different, CMBW being a mod of Brood War, but still very different than Brood War. And then, of course, Brood War and StarCraft 2, respectively. That's 3 guys. And all 3 of those cases have this exact situation happen with Zerg especially, right? They're very volatile. And you get like the attacker's advantage phenomenon. Now, I'm a little bit less familiar with StarCraft 2, to be fair, but it does seem like, if to the degree that they may have attenuated this problem, I think they probably just did it with fucking queens or something. It's just silly. But again, maybe I would look deeper and find the same kind of issues there, right? Maybe somebody more familiar with StarCraft 2's metagame can actually comment below and tell me if I'm on base here. Now, I think maybe the solution is, something like, maybe we attenuated a little bit with Larvos colonies because they give you more larvae in the early game and you can kind of like split your military and economic production, but it doesn't really matter if your opponent has the same tools, right? Because again, they can do the same thing. And I think this is what you've probably seen with larva injects in StarCraft 2 and what I seem to remember seeing anyway. And I guess beyond all of that, there's a little bit more to say on the, what does this mean, right? So we've identified the mirror matchup conundrum being that your tools are shared, and as a result, if one of you does the thing that the other one doesn't, it's easier for that person to immediately understand intuitively, in fact, how to punish you. But of course, they have to know that you were able to do it. And so maybe then we could theorize that, you might want to make it so that most of the opening strategies that exist kind of have similar power or something, and like can both be achieved or can both achieve certain things, right? And that would risk a certain uniformity where at that point, why even bother going one over the other, right? And so, in most RTS games, you just have a very linear tech progression. And so you build one structure always, and that structure turns into like, then you can build another structure always. And you think about Brood War, this is barracks into, factory into starport. For Zerg, it's spawning pool into Hydralisk Den if you even go it, spawning pool into lair into spire most of the time. And then Hydralisk Den comes after. The joke is if you ever talked to a Zerg professional player in StarCraft 1, they would think and you ask them what unlocks the Hydralisk, then they would say fucking Spire, because that's their build order every time. But anyway, the main thing that I think about is like, yeah, okay, most games are very linear with that. And so this isn't even really an issue for them, because the build orders are pretty much like the order in which you get the thing is kind of different, but you never get like Hydralisk Den before Spawning Pool in Brood War. I mean, you can't, literally, it's not allowed. And so, that's like, I guess another example would be, yeah, I guess, what the fuck would you even say? I guess you would say like you never really get Hydra Den before Spire. In some ZVP matchups you'll get it, but for the most part you would never do that. And even then, like, ZVP also can go Spire opener as well if they want to, although it's just a little bit more rare, right? Yeah, so anyway, I'm thinking about all of those things, and I'm thinking about the fact that these mirror matchup elements seems really like it's very punishing if you know what your opponent is doing. And even if you don't, you can kind of like blind counter them, or just do something where it ends up being a little coin flippy if you commit to it. I do think that if you didn't know what your opponent was doing, then being able to, like, that might create enough ambiguity and uncertainty to discourage any sort of coin flippy, committal nature things. But I don't think that would really organically solve the problem. Like, if you could just not scout your opponent, then a lot of things would change, right? And so that does tell me that maybe, like, you could theoretically do some wacky shit where if you see your enemy scouting you and it's a map that you can, isolate the ramp on or something, you just move 2 workers there and cuck the worker from coming in and block them early. It's a very economic, costly thing, and you probably won't kill the worker, so you'd have to do it for a long time. So I don't think it's actually reasonable. And it's like way worse than it is, because they could just then decide, oh, well, he's got 2 workers not mining, more than that on some maps to actually block it. So that can't work anyway. Because obviously your opponent could just like all in you at that point, you'd lose. So I think that's pretty bad. I'm trying to think about what other ways you could do it within the context of like the actual tools afforded to you by the game. But I think like the main thing that I'm seeing here is probably something to the effect of like, listen, we need to resolve the fact that the volatility is like the main concern, right? Because if you can get past the opening few minutes, then your decisions will start to fork more and more. And so if we agree that, for example, in CMBW, just, go Quaz Rock first, pretend it's Brood War, you got to build your spawning pool, like go that first. And then from there, see what happens after, right? And like, see if you can actually afford to like, do your Zethracore silliness shenanigans initially, and then follow it up with Quasis or Naths or whatever. And then if you like, at some point the map stabilizes and you guys have to play a real macro game, right? And kind of figure that out from there. I'm not really sure how we can make it so that most games end up being macro games instead of these really weird not like super committal all in type builds where if you don't kill your enemy, you're massively behind. Or if you don't deal economic damage, you're massively behind, I guess would be the more fair way of putting that. So yeah, I'm thinking about all of this and I'm thinking like, how can I like encourage that? I think you probably would need to think about how to do this on a per map basis. And there are ways of doing this in Brood War that I've already thought about. Like somebody had asked me, I guess I should probably open that up, huh? So you guys are going to hear some keyboard clicking and some various other clicks. So let's take a look at my account history here because I want to respond. So somebody had asked me, I had posted a CMBW castover where Shambler and Kian were doing tech snipes on each other. And the title was ZVZ doesn't end in 6 minutes when you play this mod, which is, maybe funny. Maybe it does now. But back then it wasn't. This is almost a month ago now. So I said somebody had posted a comment on that and said, like, here are my ideas that I've tossed around to make ZVZ more interesting. And one of them was make specific maps for ZVZ. And they had a bunch of really weird gimmick ideas, like a permanent Dark Swarm sprite. We are talking about Brood War, by the way, not CMBW, just for people's awareness. And shit like that. So what I said was, making ZVZ maps is the way to go. I'm surprised this isn't the way things are done in Brood War Pro matches, because like it genuinely does surprise me. And they asked me, what ideas do you think could be implemented to map making to make ZVZ more interesting? And what I said was that the least gimmicky way to do it would be long ground paths, and about 500 gas in the main geyser. Because again, in Brood War, you have to cap the geyser in order to mine from it, and then that very heavily limits the amount of things that you can get from that 500 gas, right? So you can spike for ling speed, lair, spire, and a muta or two, but you need to expo in order to follow up with more gas, and that will also increase ambient income, which means that you'll be able to get more workers. It'll also slow the rate of spamming muta and scourge, and generally slow the game down as a result. The other thing that I mentioned was you could leave loads of turret room. Obviously, creep doesn't spread behind resources by default, so you'd have to figure out a way to make the minerals not terrible, but also allow you to spread creep behind them. The other thing that I said is that pros will always look to solve for a clear advantage, even if it results in really boring or uninspired play patterns. And this is true no matter what esport you're talking about or what professional game you're talking about. So that's just something to keep in mind, right? Like when you're trying to solve for efficacy within a game, you don't really care if it's fun or not. Like you can have the idea that you have this fun strat and it's like, 75% effective or whatever you want to put on that. It's like it wins the game 75% of the time. Then somebody comes along with a game that wins 90% of the time, but it's fucking boring. Like doesn't matter. Pro players are going to go for the 90% one just because it's like higher percentage, right? It's the higher percentage play. So they will always go for that, right? And we have to be aware of that because as game designers, as thinkers, as people who are trying to make a good game, we don't want the game to be boring because the whole point of the game is that you engage yourself in order to become better. And also, like, to be engaged, it can't be just some boring shit that you do over and over again and it's not actually fun, right? So, like, I mean, technically you can be engaged despite that, but you guys know what I mean. Like, we would want it to be testing all of the skills that we want to test, and only building like one unit is obviously not testing that skill, and only building, one tech structure always or whatever is not testing it either. And, all these things, right? So yes, when there's a skill asymmetry or when there's an actual problem with the game, you can get situations where you only build one unit. Like there's a 2 versus 2 I played where I won't say who I was up against or even with, but I will say that what happened in that game was I took like 5 bases and mined only minerals and built only Zethar cores and we won in like probably under 10 minutes. So, or maybe it was a little bit longer than that. I can't remember, but you can imagine like that's obviously silly. And that probably means that either Zethar cores are busted, which spoiler, they're not, especially in a 2 versus 2, but either that or it's just really, really like, a skill diff, right? A skill issue, as I like to say. And people have started to pick up on that. So that's always good. If I'm ever getting like slightly salty because I'm losing a game, I complain about something, even if it's like an actual bug and totally fucked, just say skill issue. Because I like to think that even in my most ragey moments, I will recognize that's people calling me out for being a baby. And then I can just be like, true. Or something, and then GG. But anyway, that's aside the point. I just want to say that as far as the mirror matchup thing goes, like what I've basically identified is that if you have exactly the same tools at your disposal as your opponent at the beginning of the game, like you need to get to that point where it's asymmetric again, right? Like one of the things that's really joyous about RTS games that have asymmetric factions is that you are testing what to do with a set of tools that your opponent does not have access to, but must contend with. And you're also trying to contend with their set of tools that you don't have access to. And it's like, what do I have that can defeat what they have? And how can I use what I have to defeat my opponent and to conquer them, right? And that whole push and pull is really beautiful. It's one of the best things about an RTS is like the strategic layer of doing an army composition and planning your movements and moving everything around and getting into place and positioning and scouting and, adapting and all this other stuff. Right. And it almost sounds like buzzwords when you start rattling them off, but these are all the things that you're doing, all of this and so much more when you play an RTS against a competent enough opponent that can push you to the limit. And I think that's really cool, really exciting, really interesting. And, even if you always adapt into loading 2 madrigals into a Trojan and landing them in the Shambler's base, that's still some sort of move that you've decided was a good move based on some scouting. And then you obviously had to micro incredibly intensively in order to make it happen. And so good on you for doing that. But if anybody does it to me, then I'm nerfing it. Just kidding. Maybe. The main thing I will say is that when I look at how this asymmetry goes, when it is symmetric because you have the same tools because you're on the same races, then we want to sort of like almost handhold the game. This sounds really weird to say, but you almost want to like facilitate the divergence of those tools again. And that means that you have to survive long enough to build different tech structures and, access different armies, I guess you could say. Again, access different tools. And so like maybe you could be in a situation where you could try to like fast expand based on the map. Maybe, like the main thing is that if you try to make sure that by balance alone, all of the things are valid, in so far as like you're rewarded in some way or you're stabilizing in some way to go a tool that your opponent did not go, like maybe you could just increase or decrease the volatility, right? Increase the staying power of the actual race that is in question, because it does seem to revolve a lot around Zerg. But, I felt this as Protoss versus Protoss. I felt this as Terran versus Terran in CMBW a little bit, not nearly as much as Zerg, I think, from what people are telling me. I haven't played that many ZVZ, to be fair. And, all of this stuff goes into the case, right? It's like, okay, what can we do to make it so that it's more interesting or more powerful or whatever? And I think the main thing that we can think of from there is to say, let's go for an angle where we allow, like the map itself, the environment itself allows the arrival of that divergence again. Even if you start off lockstep with each other, like, yeah, let's both build Quasrock. Yeah, let's both expand at this time or attack at this time or whatever. But like at some point, ideally in the early stages of the game, so you're not just, checking off a fucking Excel sheet or whatever, then yeah, let's get to the point where we can actually play the game differently, right? Let's get to the point where we are able to really properly do what we need to do. I think that's really important. So under that circumstance, here are some map specific changes you could make for CMBW Zerg as an example. And, I already talked about the examples I gave for Brood War Zerg, but CMBW is a game I understand even to an even higher level, I would like to think, than Brood War, because obviously I've played it a lot. Although I guess, there's a lot that has yet to be explored, we'll say. And so anyway, like one of the things I was thinking of is that if you were Zerg versus Zerg, then, one thing that would probably happen. I mean, I think in general, map makers need to remember that Zerg want to watch their ramp and also expand to a nearby location. It's actually really, or I guess watch their choke, because sometimes there is not a ramp. I'm kind of guilty of doing this, facilitating this issue in Terminus as well. But there are some melee maps that we have in the pool, in the available maps or whatever, that it's really hard to like defend your choke point as Zerg, because you got to spread the creep along there, right? So I like to try to, you want to have like an intelligent sim city, as they call it, for building up a good defense and being able to like move around them and stuff, and then keep pathing nice and all that. But you also want to be able to spread the creep far enough that you can actually do what you need to do. I wonder if a potential fix for that, without you having to gimmick every single map or make a change every single map, might be to actually make it so that the Kagran colony spreads creep wider than the Hacharosk does. Although maybe the Hacharosk itself could also spread creep wider. I don't think I would complain too much about that. There's going to be some cases where you try to like hide an expansion and they incidentally find it, but that's probably not that big of a deal. So that's just a thought that just occurred to me, right? And maybe this is another thing, right? Is that as I'm talking about this whole thing, it's like, can we get to a point where we figure out, how can we make it so that, we make changes in the balance that actually do contribute positively to the problem of mirror matchups. But, there's always the untapped question of like, if somebody really good, like if somebody between the skill level of us and Flash basically decided to play CMVW, what do we do then? Like, what are they going to discover as they dominate every single person, whoever that faces them? Like, I don't know. So, yeah, that would probably be, that would be a compelling, that would be like a challenge. There's those things where you get like the long night of the soul, as it were, where it's like all of your faults have been exposed and you're just sitting there like, fuck, everything I've done is not enough. And I really need to think about this and recalibrate and try to do better. And, it's like when you get like rejected from the job promotion, or you like, ask a girl out, I guess it would be like a lesser version of this or whatever. I don't know. It's like something you really cared about gets owned in some way. That's basically what would happen to me if like a pro gamer actually started playing CMBW. They'd just expose all the fucking like things that you could exploit and abuse and stuff that I just never knew because I'm not good enough as a player. So I guess a small micro version of that actually happens when I lose a game, by the way. Obviously not to nearly the same degree, but it's like, God damn it, I'm so bad I can't even play my own game well. But anyway, we'll move on from that. Setting that to one side. So, map changes, right? You're thinking you probably want to be able to have a map where obviously the distance between the like main initial starting location and the natural expansion is like short enough that you can easily take it. You want, I think all races prefer easily defensible chokes, but I think it might be like really, really necessary for Zerg so that you can do your sort of like surface area. Well, I don't know if you guys watch any pro games in Brood War, but what they'll do in ZVZ is like move a bunch of Zetracors or Zerglings as they are called in a line, like straight up and down, so you can't actually get surface area on them, and then they can like double stack them if they need to, and that way like anybody trying to attack in just can't actually surround them or get any extra surface area. So it's pretty good. And if you're really good, you even do it in a way that it makes it hard to like you actually just lose the trade if you attack. So that's pretty neat. Now so chokes, being a little bit smaller, distances between main and nat being appropriate. What else would you see? Kind of the beauty of knowing that you're designing a map for ZVZ specifically, or like making changes to, or considering a checklist of features for ZVZ specifically, is that you don't have to worry about like one race doing it, like abusing something like tank spots or fucking islands. You can just fly a command center to or whatever. Like you don't have to worry about this at all, because like Brood War mappers have to worry about this. We wouldn't have to worry about this if we were actually making a ZVZ pool, because all we would do is just say, well, it's symmetric. Like the races are symmetric, so don't have to worry about that. Frees up the design a little bit anyway. You don't have to be concerned about that. I guess if something is really abusive, then it's like attacker advantage again. So there's that. I guess something you could try to do is just have neutral Kagrant colonies in a few spots. We've already experimented with that anyway. But what you could try to do is like put those in a few spots and then say, oh yeah, now you can hold your ramp easier or choke easier or whatever. Like maybe that's something that mappers could do if they wanted a more distant, mineral field or whatever, like a more distant expansion for the nat and stuff. It's like, okay, well, at least there's a neutral creep thing here, right? Neutral generator. So that's pretty good, IMO. The other things that are, I say that's pretty good. There's a small part of me that views pre-placing neutral units as gimmicks, but I think I have to just muffle that part of me and with a pillow or something and sit on them and just say, nah, bro, we got this. Because when you really think about it, it's like they're map features and we just don't have the, like, I think it's kind of cool that there are actual units in the game that you can build. So you build an understanding of what they do without them being specific to a map. And that's kind of neat. But also, there's some map specific or like neutral specific versions of that, right? Like bunkers that are neutral can't be lifted off, for example. So that's kind of lame in some ways anyway. But so I'm trying to go through all of this stuff and I'm thinking like map specific changes would be really good for mirror matchups if you were really worrying about a volatile setup. But maybe the more I talk about this, maybe the better way to do it would actually just be to have have the race be less volatile in general, and maybe that would help things, So these are all some thoughts that I've had anyway. The other thing that I wanted to talk about at this point is a lot of the ideas that I have for exploring player versus player combat in mirror matchups, I think we'll actually end up exploring in Onitar. And I say that because Onitar has, like, a lot of the race stuff in Onitar is super based around the identity of that race and how it sort of commingles with the identities of the other races. So you have Blood Summon, which are supposed to be like mankind's, worst, in some ways, right? Worst aspects brought to life and worst devices given agency and all of the, like, the terrible things we might do and stuff like that, right? Obviously, mankind is supposed to be like not even necessarily the best and brightest of us, but it's just like the people who strive towards an ideal. That's mankind. You've got so I try to figure out how exactly to describe the voiceless, because I've gone back and forth on like how to phrase it without it sounding like I'm a climate activist, because I find those people kind of stupid. But, they're kind of like, here's Mother Nature left to rot in some way. And, but also the degree to which we ignore our sort of natural, like there's the naturalistic fallacy where you say, oh, this is natural, so it must be good. Obviously that's not the case, because there's tons of like, brutality in the animal kingdom and rapes and stuff. So you wouldn't really want to say that's good. It might be a natural thing, but you wouldn't necessarily want to make the claim that that's actually just. So we think about all of that stuff, and it's like, okay, well, what is the voiceless then? What are the voiceless? And I think the main thing that they are a sort of like, this is what happens when you neglect your nature. This is what happens when you pervert it, and it sort of twists into something that actually hurts you. And that's sort of what the voiceless are, right? And before I would say, like, this is our, lackadaisical approach to, or our devil may care approach to, actually respecting nature and the world. But it was, obviously a lot of Onitar's sort of writing or set dressing is related to an internal sort of analysis and examination of who we are, what we are, and what we could be. And so it didn't really make sense to cobble that together with like what people may confuse with a climate-oriented activism or whatever. That's not the message I wanted to send. So I'm glad that I was able to figure out a way to say that, and hopefully a way that makes sense for you guys. And that's what the voiceless are, right? And so, and then entropic is like a grim vision of our future. I guess I can put it rather quickly and curtly there. But, yeah, so I've sort of gone over really quickly what the identity of the races in Onitar are, and I would like to sort of extend that identity through the gameplay itself. We think about Terran being this sort of imperious march towards, high, like very powerful tech that can just crush things, but they have to get there, and it's expensive, and it's clunky, and it moves slow, and it requires setup and all this other stuff. And that's why they really like to turtle, and why they can like lift their structures, but it's slow, and they can reposition stuff. And, we in CMBW, Terran feels that way. They genuinely feel like this slow to wake war machine that eventually can, blot out the sun, so to speak, with their capital crafts and stuff, and, whatever. That's like a big deal for them. And there's little sub pockets of identification within them, like, the Death March, where they have the Lazarus agent going on from Apostles, and the Lazarus Salvo from the Aeon later on, as well as the Anticathon from, both of them from the Biotic Base attached to the Iron Foundry. And you get these little micro themes almost that you sort of explore over time. Traps were actually one of them before the Eidolon lost its lobotomy mines, but that was a long time ago now. And you think about Zerg obviously being swarming. You think of Protoss being super adaptable and being able to, power on an expensive but effective, singular, powerful answer to any threat. They just need to know what to do, right? And it's deceptively not a beginner-friendly race, because you do need to know what to do, and it's a very expansive tech tree. But I guess once you learn it, it can be quite powerful, obviously. So anyway, we're thinking of all of those things and how their identities improved or were more solidified or whatever, and they became more of themselves, right? I've said this before. I don't remember if it was on the last episode of Prototype, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but there's a quote that is, I believe, I heard it on an episode of Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, the Supernova in the East series, and I think it was in the very first episode he talks about it, but there's the quote that the Japanese are like everybody else, only more so. And what I find really compelling about applying that quote to this, even though this is obviously not talking about a people during wartime, this is talking about fictional stuff, but like in CMBW, the races are themselves only more so, right? It's like Terran is more Terran now, and Protoss is more Protoss now. It's like, it's a slightly different version of what Terran means, or what Protoss means, or what Zerg means, but it's connected enough to their ancestry from the original game that you can easily follow the chain of causality there. And you can get to the point where you accept and understand, like, this is how we got here, and this is why they are that way. And so their identity rings true in their gameplay. And then you can kind of think about this as a beta version of exactly what I have been, really hammering home and saying. I really want races that, I want RTS games to have a story within them, embedded within them on the gameplay layer that you can recount just by watching back the inputs. And I think that there's a lot of untapped room for that. And so when we see things like, even in the classic StarCraft, you see little vestiges of this. You see the Mutalisks blobbing together as one organism and striking out against, the enemies of the hive. You see, obviously the swarming nature of the race in general, indicating its collectivist sort of predilection. Obviously, for like the other races, they don't have necessarily anything that's quite that strong. You could think about turret creeping, where you tank crawling and stuff. That's probably the closest you get. Maybe arbiter recalls or something, but that's more of a specific interaction and less of like a global thing. And so, yeah, like you think about the systemic changes that were made, and it's like these all increased the stability, like the purity of the identity almost. Like it increased the or at least the loudness of it. Like it's more immediately obvious. And so when you see the Terrans setting up in CMBW, or you see the Zerg, swarming, or the Protoss adapting and stuff, it's like you can kind of think about that as a way to explore the story of the match that you're watching being told to you. And we don't really think about it in those terms, especially when there's players involved, but I can 100% like guarantee you that this is a legitimate thing that could happen. We just need to get there. Right. So that's part of what I really like exploring in CMBW and in other work. And so I definitely want to do it in Onitar. And that finally takes me to when I was talking about race-specific map changes. I wanted to talk about like how Onitar would tackle this. And we've already sort of covered this on the website and also in the few spots that I've talked about Onitar. But the main thing that you would think about is, when you have, say, mankind, they're going to have some sort of like ability to set up ramps and bridges and whatnot that will be done in the middle of the match. And the voiceless will be able to have sort of like twisted trees, probably like other cover that sort of seals off passageways or helps to shape chokes and stuff. And these will be things that are going to be available to the races. Like all of the races in Onitar are going to have this sort of thing, right? Blood Summon will, I believe Blood Summon are going to be, for one, being able to teleport. Will be one of their like terrain features. You can kind of think about that as like way gates from Warcraft 3 or Nidus Canals in CMBW, because their neutral ones act that way. And Entropic are going to have these mobile platforms that you could almost kind of think about as transports, but you just like step onto them and they on regular intervals sort of move around the map and deposit you somewhere else and stuff. And so these are some of the early concepts that I have, right? But you might also see more like, I guess, contextual clues or like terrain oriented things that are, maybe they don't matter in terms of gameplay, or maybe to the degree that they do matter, it's very limited. But like Blood Summon probably has their water is replaced with blood. Now they have rivers of blood or something, something like that, right? Maybe it's even cliche in that one example, but it's things like that, right? Maybe there's more greenery around the voiceless. Maybe there are some, more asphalt placed down or concrete or something, some sort of man-made metal or something to that effect. And that's like dotting the terrain when you're near mankind outposts and whatnot. And so these are like, when you start the game, there will be these contextual clues that are based on the identity of the race. And that's based on like, those are going to be different in certain spots. So I think this will happen in every single case, and it will not be specific to like, oh, you're playing as, Blood Summon versus Blood Summon, so let's like change the map only for this one matchup. I think when Blood Summon are here, they'll have their ecological changes that also change the map in some fundamental way. And when you have mankind, it will be the same way. And as mankind, you will see like, there will be a ramp in a certain spot where there wasn't one before, or it'll, there will be some other sort of thing. Because maybe that's like too big of a change perhaps for the map layout, but maybe it's not, right? Like Blood Summon might have their, teleporter in a certain spot, and I mean, maybe we could even get to the point where as part of your pre-building, because I think, I definitely want pre-building as an idea. It was something that I was first introduced to in, funnily enough, Metal Fatigue. Thanks, shout out Rimtech Combat. Thanks, Rimtech Combat. Dude, it's Rimtech Combat's birthday on the 3rd of March. His birthday is literally 3/3, so FYI on that one, buddy. That doesn't even make sense as a sentence, but don't worry, nobody noticed. The main thing that I wanted to say about that was when you have pre-building, you're like, say you just start a mission. This is like a campaign mission, for example, and you have like 500 minerals, right, in CMBW, or in the case of like Onitar, or I guess CM retail, you have like 500 magmite and 250 hyper vials. It's like, all right, what can I spend this money on? Well, you can just start with like a bunch of things, or you can say like, to give the player the opportunity to select where their command center starts, where their masons begin, how many masons they train. Do they build a barracks with their, some of their starting money or whatever, right? And so you can imagine all of this stuff working in that way, where you have like, okay, here's my Ansifi quarry. I got like 10 apprentices. I really wanted an economic start, so I got 10 instead of the normal 6. And that left me with less money, so I couldn't really get too much other infrastructure, but I built like a, static defense structure or something like that instead, just to be safe or whatever, right? And so you could imagine the pre-building phase basically allowing players to do that. And so maybe that would also be something that happens where it's not just that the map changes based on who spawns where, but also it could be that the player dictates where to put the ramp or where to put the teleporter or whatever. But at the very least, I think the map would change based on which race was in what spot. And I think that would be a really interesting way to reduce volatility anyway, where it's like, this is probably one area where we can, similar to the idea of like, oh, your Zerg, let me move your natural a little bit closer. Like that's not possible normally, but maybe it's possible to give like a little bit more build space or whatever in Antikythera. Like we can actually edit the map in real time. So we don't have to worry about like, oh, we want to make a change to the map, but it doesn't work or something. And I don't necessarily want to shield myself with this where it's like, oh, I didn't make a game that was functional enough, so this race always needs a little bit of hand-holding. That's not really my aim for this, and I am aware that it could come across that way or could actually be that sort of like a side effect. But I think the reason why I wouldn't want to trial this sort of thing in Onitar is because the game is already very much about like how we impact our environment to some degree and like what the rate, like all the different, I guess you could consider it a dialogue or a conversation or a meditation on a reflection of some sort on, what it means to be human and like what all these things are. And so a lot of it is very much wrapped up in our identities and the identities of the races. And if we can make the battlefields themselves reflect that, I think that's really cool. And obviously a way to sort of turn it around and say, hey, bro, we made an RTS that's actually about something. Like that's shocking, really. And so like that's a case where all of the identity specific things about the races would feed into the cases where we have something like this, right? It would actually be building on top of the systems we have in place, and it would be a gameplay affecting sort of reflection or aspect of the story or window dressing or setting or whatever you want to call it. And it would be a way for that to be reflected. And I think that's really cool anyway. So I've covered all that. I've covered mirror matchups. I honestly think that the Kagrant, like the spreading creep in a wider radius might be in order in general. So I'm glad that came away from it with something in mind for CMBW, but I will meditate on that one because I want to consider it without it being late at night at the end of a podcast. But that has been Prototype episode 2. I think in the next one, I don't really have any concrete ideas for what I want to talk about, but I was writing a Substack article about identity, and so that's why I figured I'd package it together with the conversation about mirror matchups. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Onitar because it's been a while since I've really produced any content or spoken about it. Shout out to Mirian, who talks a lot in the server, occasionally just has a question and decides to ask it and provokes some conversation sometimes, or at the very least, he gets an answer to his question. So he's also been a supporter on the coffee page for Week7 and myself. The URL is Pronogo and Week7, right? Co-fee.com. Why the fuck is it dash, bro? Was co-fee taken? Come on. Anyway, you can find the link below if you want to give us some money. The next episode, we'll probably talk about being a lead designer, I think. That's probably something that I want to talk about because I figure it might be useful for just some thoughts. Like when you're a lead designer for something, especially if that something is getting, playtime from people who actually in the first episode of Prototype, I did talk about like we have responsibilities as developers to make sure that our content isn't causing crashes and wasting people's time. So there's like an extension of that's specific to if you're designing a game and there's a competitive side to that game, even if it's not professional or whatever. Like you don't want to give them a game where it's like fundamentally there's something that's busted, binary, broken, whatever. So I'll probably talk about that. But don't hold me to it because maybe I'll get an idea for something else. And anyway, see you on the next 3.